Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. If you know my personality, I'm a pretty laid-back guy and I try to avoid stress and anxiety whenever possible. However, there are 6 issues about boa constrictors that really keep me up at night. Today I wanted to discuss these 6 issues facing boas that have the potential to end boa keeping as we know it. If you're new to the channel, this is the place for information about all aspects of keeping and breeding boa constrictors in captivity, so be sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my future boa videos. The first thing that could doom reptile keeping as we know it are mites. And these parasitic bloodsuckers have become increasingly common over the last few decades, and once they're established in your collection, they can be nearly impossible to eradicate. So I did a whole video about mites, about my experiences I've had with them and how I got rid of them. So be sure to check out this video if you haven't seen it already. But what I'll say is that mites are becoming more and more common, and this is partially due to the fact that people are buying and selling boas and other reptiles almost like they were baseball cards. Someone might buy a boa on the classified sites or at a reptile show. They might not take the proper quarantine procedures, and then they might sell it just a month or two later. So they may actually sell the boa before they even realize it has mites. So it's really an issue. Mites are really a scourge of the reptile hobby. And not just do they cause physical damage to your snakes, but they also can cause psychological damage to the keepers who are struggling to get rid of them. And I've actually heard about several breeders that had large collections and they spent years of their life trying to fight these little blood-sucking invertebrates. Ultimately they gave up. It just wasn't worth the struggle and the hassle, and the mites won. So you should do everything you can to keep mites out of your collection. As I said, watch that video that I did and make sure you don't get mites, because if you have mites, it's truly a snake keeper's nightmare. The second factor that might spell the end of boa keeping as we know it is the loss of FedEx shipping of boas and other reptiles. So FedEx makes it really easy to ship boas door to door, and before there was FedEx, you had to ship by air freight collect, which meant that you would have to go to your nearest airport to pick up the shipment, which could be hours away depending on where you live. And it was also quite a bit more expensive. But FedEx has made it really convenient. And then there's even websites like Ship Your Reptiles or Reptiles Express. And these are communal FedEx accounts where you don't even need your own account. You can just go right through one of these services, and it makes it super easy to ship reptiles by FedEx. However, there's nothing to stop FedEx from making the decision that they're no longer going to allow reptiles. And if this happened, we really wouldn't have a backup. And when you do ship reptiles by FedEx, there's certain rules that have to be followed. Obviously, you can't have any venomous animals. They have to be packaged in styrofoam-lined boxes. And my real concern is that someone is going to not follow these rules, and maybe they'll ship a rattlesnake and they'll just put it right in the box, and then the rattlesnake gets out, in shipment and bites one of the FedEx workers. I'm actually pretty surprised something like this hasn't happened already. So I'm really worried that the FedEx might say we're not going to ship reptiles anymore. I've had a few shipments shipped to me that were not really properly packaged, and they were a violation of FedEx rules. I had one shipment was actually was shipped by UPS, which is completely illegal. They just took a couple boas, put them in a pillowcase, and then they put that in it was a Pampers diaper box of all things, and just shipped to UPS. So luckily the boas were fine, but it was completely against the rules. I also had a FedEx shipment where there were 2 boas that were about 3 feet long. They were about a year old or so, and both of them were stuffed into this little tiny deli cup. Like there was barely enough space for the boas just to be in the deli cup, and it actually opened up during the shipment, of course, because they were trying to get out, and the boas were loose in the box that was styrofoam lined. So luckily they stayed in the box. But it just shows you that there's all kinds of possibilities for someone not to follow the rules and to mess it up for everybody. So be sure when you're shipping by FedEx, carefully package your boxes by the rules so you don't risk, something happening and then FedEx stops shipping reptiles. The third factor that could doom reptile keeping as we know it are rising costs. And of course, the cost of everything is always going up over time, but it seems like certain things in reptile keeping have gone up over the last decade at faster than the price of it, or the rate of inflation. The first is shipping. And we just talked about FedEx, but FedEx prices have really gone up. It seems like in the last 5 years or so, they've pretty much doubled in price. So it's costing me right now to ship a small boa like this year-old Hog Island about $70 for the priority overnight shipping for just one small snake. And if you want to ship a bigger package, it's going to be quite a bit more. And this is through using Reptiles Express, where I get a little bit of a discount. If I just shipped outside of Reptiles Express, it would probably be like $90 to $100. So that's quite a bit of money to ship a reptile. And if you're talking about buying $2,000 worth of rare Locality boas, an extra $70 isn't that much. But if you're just a beginning reptile keeper that just wants a basic common boa for $100, having to pay $70 on top of that that's a lot of money. So FedEx is one thing that keeps going up in price. Another important thing in reptile keeping that keeps going up in price is electricity. And that's especially so here in the great state of California, whose government has run it into the ground. The people that run the state decided, well, we'll get rid of the more dependable energy production of coal-burning plants and fossil fuels in favor of green energy like windmills and solar. And while I'm completely for environmental protection and environmentally sound decisions, just to get rid of the electricity and get in a situation where there's not enough electricity to go around as a result just doesn't make sense. And we have like 40 million people in the state. There's now regularly rolling blackouts when they run out of electricity. They just shut it off for a certain percentage of the population. And the price is exorbitant. I'm paying at this point up to something like 45 cents a kilowatt hour, which is several times the national average. So electricity is costing a lot. And if you just have a few snakes, a small collection, it's not that big a deal. But when you have a decent sized collection, you're going to spend quite a bit of money every month on electricity. And then of course there's rodents. The price of rodents just keeps going up as well as the price of the shipping of the rodents. The overhead costs to running a boa breeding facility have really skyrocketed over the last 5 to 10 years or so. And while fortunately there's a big demand for boas, so it makes sense for people to breed them, if these costs continue to go up, it might get to a point where it dooms the boa hobby as we know it. The fourth issue that might spell the end of boa keeping as we know it is emerging disease. And in the world of boas, the disease which gets the most anxiety is IBD, or inclusion body disease. This is a neurological disease which has been around since at least the 70s. And I'm actually planning a video where I'm going to go in depth into the biology of IBD and what's known about it. So stay tuned in the future for that one. But I'll just say that I'm not quite as concerned about IBD and disease as I am about some of these other factors. As I mentioned, this disease has been around for at least the last 40 years, and it probably isn't spreading nearly as fast as it's made out to be in certain chat forums and Facebook groups. If you use proper quarantine and proper sanitation procedures, you keep your animals separately, you don't have any mites, odds are that IBD is probably not going to be that much of an issue for you. However, there's always the possibility that some new disease emerges which might spell the end of boa keeping as we know it. The fifth thing that could spell the end of boa keeping as we know it are laws and increasing restrictions on boas, including boa bans. And there's already quite a few cities where boa constrictors are banned, including San Francisco and New York City. In fact, in these places, any constricting snake is banned. There are other cities where snakes of a certain size are banned. For example, any snake greater than 8 feet long is banned. Unfortunately, there are groups of people out there with a perverse agenda to end all uses of animals by humans, including as pets. And snake owners are an easy target because there are fewer snake owners than, say, cat and dog owners, and snake owners are viewed as being somewhat eccentric. So it's easy to go after the snake keepers when you're trying to get new laws passed in order to advance your animal rights agenda. The people that are trying to ban reptiles as pets scored a major victory back in 2015 through something called the Lacey Act. And so this effectively banned the transport of several species of large constrictor across state lines. The Lacey Act actually dates back over 100 years, and this was an act put forth to protect endangered species, and it made it illegal to transport them across state lines. So somehow they were able to finagle this act to ban the transport of these pet constrictors, and it had to do with the Burmese pythons that are loose in the Florida Everglades. And of course this is a huge environmental problem and it needs to be addressed, but the Lacey Act was really not the appropriate way to do this, and it was basically a power grab to try to ban sale of snakes. So although this act didn't specifically make it illegal to own these large constrictors, it made it illegal to transport them. So who's going to be breeding Burmese pythons in, say, Alabama when you can't sell them outside of the state of Alabama? It just doesn't make any sense. And this ban applied to both types of anaconda, yellow and green, Burmese pythons, Indian pythons, reticulated pythons, African rock pythons, and a few other types of large constricting snakes. Fortunately, boa constrictors were never added to the ban. But it went into effect in 2015, and no one really knew what was going to happen, what the future of the reptile industry was going to be. A lot of people who had invested in Burmese python morphs ended up losing a lot of money because they can't really breed their animals now because there's no market for them. They just have to, they're limited to their own state to sell them. But luckily, the United States Association of Reptile Keepers, USARK, filed a lawsuit and was able to overturn the ban in 2017, and now this no longer applies, and these species can be transported legally across state lines. So this was a great victory for reptile keepers, but unfortunately the animal rights agendas are still out there, so we can expect that these types of groups will try to limit or ban ownership of our animals in the future. The final issue that could spell the end of boa keeping as we know it applies specifically to locality boas, such as this Venezuelan Redtail Boa, and that's the loss of pure locality boas. And there's a couple ways that this could happen. The first, and probably the most obvious, is that people start breeding these pure locality boas with morph boas or other locality boas of a different type. And once you cross two boas together, the offspring are never going to be pure locality boas. So you can never regenerate the pure locality. In addition, if people don't carefully record documentation of where they got the boas and their localities, and they don't have some kind of pedigree to back the animal up, you can also lose the pure locality status in that fashion. There's also a second issue facing the purity of locality boas in captivity, and that's the fact that most countries where boas live are no longer allowing exports of animals from the wild. What this means is that there's not going to be any introduction of fresh genetic stock into breeding projects in the future, and that you will have to increasingly inbreed your animals in order to keep them pure for that locality. And I did a video on inbreeding in boas not too long ago, so check that one out if you want to hear all about inbreeding. It may or may not have serious consequences on the fitness of the boas and their long-term survival in captivity. We don't know how long you can inbreed animals and still have a sustainable population. It might be longer with boas than it is with some other types of animals like mammals and birds. But even if inbreeding doesn't prove to be completely deleterious to future breeding of these animals, there's another issue, and that is something called genetic drift. And if we start a breeding colony based on a small sample of animals from the wild population, it's not really going to be representative of the whole wild population. And with every generation of breeding in captivity, it's going to be more and more different from the wild population. So it's really not sustainable to have a pure representative population of locality boas in captivity unless you're regularly adding fresh stock from the wild population, you know, every few generations or so. And this might not be possible. So basically what's going to happen is that the animals will still be a pure locality boa. They're derived from a pure locality, but they're not really the same because they're now being in captivity changes them. And it's a little bit more every generation. So at some point they basically become like morph boas. They're a captive representation of a wild boa. And while this isn't really that big of a deal as far as a pet quality animal, a lot of people are into the locality boas because they want something that preserves the wild genetic stock, or, you know, the wild look of the boa constrictor. And at some point it's not really going to be realistic to consider them the same thing anymore. Many of the countries where boas live are now completely closed to any export of any animals, and this is really unfortunate. If they allowed out a small number, say a few dozen a year, to go to dedicated herpetoculturists, we could breed them in captivity and have a buffer against loss of them in the wild. And when you think about it, a lot more boas are collected for their skins, or they're killed as a result of deforestation or, you know, roadkill, run over on roads, things like that. So a few dozen a year would probably have very small effect on the population compared to these other factors. And unfortunately, I don't see it changing anytime soon. I think that the availability of boas from the wild is actually going to get less and less as time goes on. And while I certainly support conservation by whatever means possible, I think that if they don't allow any boas out and there's not this backup reservoir of animals in captivity, that we might lose them not just in the wild, but have nothing left in captivity either, which would be a real shame. So there you go. These are 6 things that keep me up at night that I feel could spell the end of boa keeping as we know it. I'm sure there's something I left out that might cause you anxiety about boa keeping, so let me know in the comments below what worries you the most about the future of boa keeping, and if there's anything that I missed. I certainly hope that these things don't come true, but unfortunately, being a realistic pragmatist, I think that there's a pretty good chance that these factors will only get worse in the future. So I hope this was helpful. As always, shoot me any questions or comments you have. Thanks for watching and enjoy your boas.